people register. Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to wait about 5 more minutes, let people in. We have about 200 people registered. We have about 50 in the room already. You can see that the agenda is up on the board. We made a slight addition so that Dean Hubbard, our executive director, can talk to us about the PSC. I don't know if it's amicus or amicus brief or either or, but AMI is friendly. So I know that from having been a teacher for so many years. And Dean can only talk to us earlier in the meeting, and we can ask him a few questions, and then we're going to move on to the meat of our meeting, which is the yin and yang of our physical urban environment. We have two outstanding speakers, both members of our chapter, both well-known names. We're very proud to have them at CUNY, and as part of our retiree chapter, very accomplished gentlemen, Tom Angotti and Alan Feigenberg. I'll introduce them when they speak in a short while. And then we'll have our update on Medicare Advantage from Debbie, which I don't know if there'll be that much new, but we always want to make sure that we're available to talk with you about anything that is new or to answer your questions. So let's see. We have 58 people in the room. I'm going to wait. Is Dean here yet? No, Dean Hubbard?
I don't see him on the list yet.
Okay,
I
well,
just emailed him.
it's just 1 o'clock. So while we're waiting, Tom and Alan, the way we have this set up is we'll have Tom go first, then Alan, and then we'll take questions for both of you. Does that seem to work?
That's fine.
Is that okay with you, Alan?
Yeah. You?
Yeah, that's okay.
That's fine. Whatever.
Or we could do some questions after you're done, Tom, then go to Alan, and then he can take questions, and then we could take questions for both of you. It really is up to you. However, you prefer to work. We'll see.
I would imagine we each present and then leave the questions for the end.
I agree.
Sounds good. Okay.
So then optimally, if there's a question, Tom and I will get into an argument about it.
Well, that's the yin and yang, right?
Yeah.
That's the yin and
That's
yang
right.
of life. You're gonna
Yep.
don't get into too esoteric an argument so that we can't figure out what you're, trying
Ain't gonna
to
happen.
that has nothing to do with having two men in the room. I know that, Alan, because both of you are very aware that we don't argue, we debate, we discuss.
Yes.
And obviously, we have a very mixed audience. We have some people who may be more familiar with the topics that you gentlemen are going to talk to us about today. We have some people who may be more on the novice level, so I'm sure that you're both going to make this very accessible to everybody. Where is Dean? I really hate to start you, Tom, and then interrupt. The issue is that Dean has a meeting at 2:00.
Yeah, you told us.
Ava, did you text him?
Yes, texted and emailed, but I don't hear anything, so I don't know. I think you guys might wanna move on and figure out something.
Well, I think then what we'll do is I'll open the meeting and welcome everybody to 2024, January 8th, 2024. It's the first meeting of a new year. I hope you all had a nice holiday, a healthy and safe holiday, and I hope that you are all well. I think that if we start the program now, Debbie, are you prepared to talk about the brief a little bit if necessary?
Not really.
Okay,
I mean, I've read it, but
Okay.
I was not involved in preparing it or
okay.
or
Well, what we'll do then is I'll wait just a couple more minutes and then we'll start with Tom. I'm
Okay.
not going to interrupt you, Tom. If Dean comes on, we'll let you finish. And then we'll have a break to hear about the amicus brief, which is not ideal. But let me give Dean a call myself just one more time to how many of you are aware of the brief? The brief was just filed on January the 5th, on Friday.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we should start. We have speakers waiting and I don't want to keep you waiting. And we have almost 100 people in the room. Okay, so welcome again, everybody, to the first retiree chapter meeting of 2024. And the topic is the yin and yang of our physical urban environment, architecture and city planning. And please bear with me. I have a bit of a what I hope is a cold and nothing more than that. So this is what our speakers have wrote in their blurb that they're going to talk about. Everything we experience in our city, the buildings, the open spaces, reflect and constitute the divisions of class, religion, culture, and immigration status. All issues that we are interested in as a union and many issues that we have explored in previous programs. How can an awareness and commitment foster and organize for progressive humane change, and what can move us forward? We have two very illustrious speakers today. As I mentioned before, some of you might have come on. Two of our own retirees from CUNY, to activists, to high-powered researchers, to teachers. And we're going to start with Tom, and I'll introduce him. We'll listen to Tom and see what he has to say. And then we'll go to Alan Feigenberg. Both of them will share information, perspectives, and their active involvement and encourage an open-ended dialogue. So I hope that we'll have a lively and informative discussion. Okay, Tom.
Okay, well, thanks for.
Oh, wait a minute, Tom. I have to brag about you before you
okay.
start.
Go ahead.
I have to tell people all of the wonderful things that they should know, but maybe they don't all already know. Tom, or Thomas Angotti, is Professor Emeritus of Urban Policy and Planning at Hunter College and the Grad Center at City University. He's an adjunct professor at the New School. He was the founder and director of the Hunter College Center for Community Planning and Development. His recent books include Transformative Planning, Radical Alternatives to Neoliberal Urbanism, Zoned Out, Race, Displacement, and City Planning in New York City, Urban Latin America, Inequalities and Neoliberal Reforms, The New Century of the Metropolis, and New York for Sale, Community Planning Confronts Global Real Estate. And that book won the David Doff Book Award. Tom is an editor of ProgressiveCity.net and participating editor for Latin American Perspectives and Local Environment, a longtime member of the board of directors of the Cooper Square Community Land Trust in New York City. And I give you Tom Angotti. Tom, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. This meeting is being recorded.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and it's great to be here. I'm going to try to cover some basic history that will reveal some of our common roots with architecture. But urban planning started with the first human settlements, but the profession, what we know as the profession, begins in the late 19th century with the construction of new towns in England. And in the 20th century, the roots of planning in the United States are in the introduction of zoning and comprehensive planning in individual states. We don't have a national urban policy. We don't have a national urban planning system. It's a federal system, and that's a big explanation for why urban planning doesn't have strong roots in this country. It's rooted. It's in a federal system, and each state has its own laws and mechanisms governing planning. Many states don't really even claim to do any urban planning, and many municipalities don't. New York City. So I won't go through the whole international and national context, but New York City, the earliest roots of planning are in the Manhattan grid. Famously chops up pieces of Manhattan into sellable lots. And that's revealing kind of the way that urban planning arises with real estate development. And that's the thing that, if you try to understand planning in New York City, you have to know real estate. They're not separate. They're joined. New York City doesn't have a comprehensive plan like most major cities in the United States do. But there was a debate going on over 100 years ago after Central Park was built, and merchants in downtown Manhattan started getting nervous because immigrants were starting to root themselves in residential neighborhoods next to the Fifth Avenue and luxury shops on Fifth Avenue. So they said they brushed away proposals to do a comprehensive plan for the city so that you could separate industry and different types of housing from the commercial districts. But the bosses said no, because that would put too much in the hands of the technocrats and the planners. Real estate wanted to control this. So they invented zoning. Well, they didn't invent it, but they decided we're going to have a zoning resolution and a zoning ordinance that's going to govern what can be built, where it can be built, block by block, lot by lot, and it's going to regulate building height, how much you can build on a particular site, and what can go into it. You can and the idea was to separate industry from residential, from commercial. And so 1916, the zoning ordinance takes effect. And the city of New York, one of the largest in the United States, still does not have a comprehensive plan. But it has a humongous zoning resolution that packs inside of it all of the regulations. Now, why does real estate like this? Because real estate is really what does the planning. Why do they like zoning? Because zoning can be changed through regulation or a change of regulations done by the City Planning Commission. City Planning Commission, which did not get established until the 1930s, is essentially dominated by a strong mayor. The mayor has the majority of appointees to the governing board, and guess what section of the economy and society has the greatest influence on the mayor? The real estate industry. So when a developer finds that there's a real estate opportunity in a place like the Lower East Side, for example, which is centrally located in between two major high-rise districts, they can go to the City Planning Commission and say, we need to change the zoning so in order to facilitate more high-rise development in the Lower East Side. And lo and behold, those kinds of zoning changes are what constitute the essence of the political struggle over land use and zoning in New York City. Overall, big real estate, and real estate is big in New York City. It's the largest single source of income and taxes, by the way. And so it's a very convenient way of doing business and of planning. There have been numerous proposals for doing a comprehensive plan. Real estate has managed to kill every one of them. Why? Because it takes control out of this relationship between City Hall, a powerful City Hall, and the real estate industry. There is an army of zoning lawyers in New York City whose business revolves around being able to hire a small coterie of professionals who understand zoning and who know how to get around it and how to change it in order to facilitate development. So bottom line, planning and the City Planning Commission is the appointed body. The City Planning Department is the organization, the agency of professionals who are supposed to ensure that the zoning gets changed in accordance with basic land use and social and political principles. A part of my shady life in the past was working for the city planning department. And I can tell you from the inside as well as from the outside, it really has no power. That and my own connection to the housing struggles in New York City and my community organizing experience led me to initiate several community or support several community-based plans. So community planning arises in the 1980s with roots in the civil rights movement. It was in the 1980s, the New York City Charter was changed in the transition from the old system of governance to the current system. And it was at the impetus of the civil rights movement, which forced the city to eliminate the Board of Estimate, which was the dominant governing body, a political elite, and replace it with a mayor and a stronger city council. And the civil rights movement was behind that because the principle involved was one person, one vote. But the Board of Estimate was made up of a borough president from each borough. So the borough president from Staten Island, mostly white, had the same power as the borough president from Manhattan, which was largely, had a large population of people of color. So civil rights groups took the city to court, changed the charter, and that had generated and coincided with a grassroots movement to control planning, communities doing their own planning. So I spent a lot of my time, both when I worked inside city planning and afterwards when I left to go back to teaching, started the Hunter Center for Community Planning to help community boards and community-based organizations develop their own plans. And that was sort of the signature of the work that I did for most of my years, was working at the grassroots level, because that's where issues of social justice were most ripe. And that's where the civil rights movement emerged at the community level in the fight for the charter change, in the fight for the institution of a new model for approving land use changes with the new form of government. And so my signature approach has always been, and I was much sought after, I must say, because there aren't a lot of community planning experts around, because nobody does it in New York City.
Right.
And nobody who's a professional planner does it. You don't get paid. You don't. There are no high, deep-pocketed developers who are going to support community-based planning. But it too came out of the civil rights movement. The fight for community schools back in the 60s also coincided with an effort and it coincided with the period of the Black Panthers and other efforts to gain control over community services. So people started demanding in communities of color, we should be able to control development. And we should be able to control what kinds of resources are needed in order to improve the community. So there was this community-based planning. It's sort of in the 1980s, it took off even with greater intensity, along with the environmental justice movements. Why did community planning become a big issue for environmental justice? Well, neighborhoods are trying to get rid of waste transfer stations that concentrated in their neighborhoods and produced all kinds of public health issues. Well, they couldn't zone out waste transfer stations. They didn't have the power. They didn't have the they didn't have the power. They didn't have access. And so we want to do our own community plans. And that's where we built a citywide movement for community planning. It peaked during the Giuliani administration because Giuliani was the anti-community mayor and did everything possible to uproot any efforts of local control in communities of color and low-income communities. He did everything to attack them when they wanted to gain control over land. And so the movement for community-based planning surged, and we had almost 100 large and small community plans, many of them arising from the grassroots. Most of them never got a hearing, a public hearing. And then with the charter revision, an element was inserted into the charter that would allow communities to get their plans officially approved. They're called 197A plans because they were done under Section 197A of the city charter. About 17 of them have passed up until now, which is minimal, and very few new ones are being done. Why? Because the city has city planning department and the city planning commission, with the full approval of the mayor's office, and thank you, Mr. Bloomberg, as well, who managed very well to speak highly of community plans and do everything possible to make sure that they never got to City Hall. And so the 17 plans were officially approved and none have been implemented. Because of the resistance within city planning, who has officially adopted the view that, well, it's a formally adopted plan, but we don't have anything else to say about it. It's done. And it doesn't change the zoning, because the zoning is what really matters. It tells you what you can build, where you can build it, how much, and so forth. So zoning trumped planning. And I guess that brings us to today, that where we still find real estate essentially determining what can be built, where it can be built. If the zoning doesn't allow it, they go to the city hall. Real estate is the biggest lobbyist or the biggest source of funds for lobbyists in New York City. They go to City Hall and they get a promise for a zoning change. And here we are, comprehensive planning. A small group of us have continued to argue for true comprehensive planning. There was a charter initiative that would have required a comprehensive plan for every community once every 10 years. I'm sorry, not for every community, citywide comprehensive plan, once every 10 years. And as much as I felt that was a good idea, I spoke against it. Many others spoke against it because it did not empower communities. The city planners would be the ones who developed the proposal for the city plan. And then communities would have to scramble in order to get their voices heard to make any changes. It's all top down, which is the way it gets done now. And it's the reason why so many communities. Well, and I guess a final note about this is until recently, the planning hierarchy would refuse to recognize the role of race. That race mattered when it comes to where do you upzone or change the zoning in order to promote new development, and where do you maintain the zoning in order to protect what already exists. It's determined in great part by race. So I'm going to leave with a plug for this book, Zoned Out, which is one of my recent books that I co-edited. It's available at NYU Press. And the subtitle is Race, Displacement, and City Planning in New York City. Displacement is the other thing I'd like to lay on the table as the central issue for communities of color. Serial displacement is the story of African-American history. You get displaced from your home in Africa to a plantation or to a city in the US, and for your entire life, you can't afford to own a home, can't afford to own property, and through the up until only recently, redlining by the federal government prevented banks from loaning money to purchase housing, and that's called redline, drawing a red line around your census tract. And if you live in that census tract and it's more than 5% Black, you don't qualify for a federally guaranteed loan. So race really matters now even more so because under the last major zoning blitz by Mayor de Blasio, was to rezone communities of color. And almost uniformly, they all rejected this gift from the liberal mayor, who de Blasio, to his credit, said, we're going to have a new requirement. If we rezone your neighborhood, up to 30% of all new housing that's built will have to be affordable. And the response came from communities of color: affordable to who? And the city devised a system to guarantee that low-income people of color had the least chance of getting into one of those apartments. It became a citywide lottery, and so it did not target people who were in the greatest need for affordable housing. So the book, Zoned Out, is about the community struggles to stop the rezonings. And I'm proud to say I was part of those struggles and worked with them, and that's the basis for that book. And so I guess the final note, and this will be truly the final one, is the biggest problems, I know Alan's gonna get into this too, is have to do with the infrastructure in the city that are making it difficult to make progress and to beat climate change. And the storms that are here and are forthcoming from flooding the coastlines, a sewer system that's well over 100 years old that can't handle current capacity, an infrastructure that is that can be eliminated, as we saw in Superstorm Sandy, overnight, because it's too big, too costly, and too pervasive to really survive in the period of climate change. So we got a sewer system well over 100 years old that by itself, even without increased flooding, is in dire straits. And in case you haven't noticed, New York City has the worst traffic jams in the country. Somebody recently calculated the average speed of a car in Manhattan is about 9 miles an hour. What do you need a car for if you're going to go 9 miles an hour? It's the dumbest thing. And you have the biggest mass transit system in the United States, yet there's a traffic jam every day. And so the transit system, the traffic system, water and sewer systems, the infrastructure is begging for comprehensive planning. But all of those services are siloed. Transportation Department, Department of Environmental Protection, and the Parks Department has its own. And so a comprehensive approach is being held back because of a political system that is controlled by real estate. They don't want comprehensive planning. They don't want to solve the big problems. They could care less about climate change because they amortize their real estate investments in 20 years. That's the farthest they can think ahead. And they don't think government should be able to get ahead of them. So those are the issues that I've been involved in. I think those are the biggest questions, the planning questions that are still ripe. The rejection of comprehensive planning has been so deep and so profound. It's very difficult to find an elected official or a candidate who is going to reveal the secrets. Alan.
Thanks. So, hello, everybody. And there's going to
Sorry,
be
Ellen, can I just interrupt for a second?
Of course.
Sorry, Dean is here on the Zoom call with us now. I don't know, Anne, if you saw that message, but do you want to pause this presentation?
I'm very sorry
Yes.
that I was on mute while you were talking, Ava. Yes, I'm sorry, very sorry, Alan, that we're going to do this quick interruption.
No apologize. This is important.
And because Dean is, thank you very much, Tom. And lest I forget to credit her later, and I should have credited her earlier in the meeting, Marcia Newfield is really the genesis behind the idea for this program today. She is one one of our most Renaissance women member people that I know, and she sees crystally clearly the intersections of all these themes that we keep hitting on at our different meetings, whether it's environmental justice, race, class, real estate, capital. And this was her idea for a program.
Yep.
She's also taking the notes today, and she's going to do a fabulous write-up because she's a fabulous writer. So Marcia, thank you very, very much. And I'm sure once we hear Alan and once we hear the discussion, debate back and forth, we'll realize how valuable your suggestion was. So I'm going to bring on Dean Hubbard briefly to tell us about is it an amicus brief or an amicus brief or either, to talk to us about this very recent development in our struggle on the Medicare front. I hear Dean is in the house. Dean is in the house. All right, Dean, we started without you because we figured we had an audience waiting, and so we're going to take a little hiatus here and hear what you have to say. I know you have to leave at 2:00, and thank you for making time to come and talk to us today. This is very important.
Yeah.
Are
I
you
think you're a
unmuted?
co-host, Dean. Sorry, no? Sorry, hold on one second.
I'm putting myself on mute.
Okay, can you unmute now?
Yes, thank you so much, and apologize to everyone, particularly the speakers on this very important topic of community development, and community planning, for the interruption. I'm going to just briefly let folks know that our legal team did file last week an amicus brief. I think it's either or, depending on preference, amicus, amicus. But we did file the brief last week supporting the injunction issued last summer by Judge Frank, which prevents the city from implementing a forced Medicare Advantage program. Where the case stands right now is that the city has filed its papers seeking to have an appeals court that's called the Appellate Division. It's the first level appeals court, overturn Judge Frank's injunction. The Municipal Labor Committee, the MLC, which is the coalition of unions that negotiate healthcare with the city, they have weighed in support of the city's position. We have now filed our amicus brief in support of Judge Frank's injunction, and then the retirees will be submitting their papers in support of the injunction later this month. The brief is actually on the PSC website, and I'm gonna post a link to it in the chat, so you can read it yourself. Oh, it's got that Chrome extension on it. Hang on, let me give you the correct link. So when you have to take off the Chrome extension. So there you go. So it's the second one. I think that'll lead you to the link. So our attorneys made two arguments. It was rather straightforward. The first argument we made was that Judge Frank was correct when he found that Section 12-126 requires the city to pay the entire cost of retiree health coverage, including the cost of Medicare supplemental insurance, aka Medigap. And that was the part of Judge Frank's decision, which required the city to keep senior care in place. We argued basically that the judge was correct in interpreting the statute at section 12-126 of the Administrative Code to require the city to pay the entire cost of retiree health care, and that the move into Medicare Advantage would expose retirees to costs that they don't pay under traditional Medicare, such as the ability to require prior authorizations, which would impose costs on retirees that Medicare doesn't impose. We also know that the city and MLC have argued that interpreting the statute this way interferes with collective bargaining, which is established, they argue, under state law, a law called the Taylor Law. And basically we make the argument that putting a floor under the city's contribution to what it pays for healthcare does not interfere with collective bargaining in any way, any more than something like the minimum wage or paid leave laws interfere with collective bargaining. It's simply a minimum, and the parties can negotiate above that minimum, but they are not at liberty to go below the minimum that's established by the law. So that's the argument we made in the amicus brief. It's been filed, and once the retirees have submitted their papers, then the court will schedule oral arguments, and then we expect a decision from the court after that. Exactly the timetable for it is hard to say, but in the meantime, as folks are aware, the injunction remains in place. And so we are dealing with the status quo in terms of retiree health care. And so the folks who have traditional Medicare plus senior care are able to continue taking advantage of it. So that's my brief report. And I don't know, Anne, if there's time for some questions. And Anne is muted.
Yes, I apologize again. Anne is unmuted now. Anne
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, because I have a heavy cough and I don't want to keep interfering with people who are speaking. So thank you for the reminder. Okay, so I see we've got 5 hands. Let's see if we can get those done in the 10 minutes that Dean has. I see in this order, Lizette Cologne, Jack Hammond, I guess that's John Hyland, Michael Engber, and Marcia Newfield. Lizette.
Yes, hello to everybody, and my best wishes for this 2024 to be a better year. Thank you for that report and for filing an amicus brief on our behalf on the PSC. But I have a couple of questions. You say in that amicus brief that the MLC can negotiate on behalf. We all know that that's not the case. Secondly, what is the reason that we as PSC has not gotten in touch yet with the New York City Organization for Public Service Retirees, who were the ones who established the whole court case? They still have not had any contact with PSC, and they have been asking for their support, for our support. And if you submit an amicus brief on support of a court case, I would say, I'm not an expert in law, but I would say, let me call these people and find out from them, from the source, what should we be addressing in this amicus brief? Thank you.
Thanks, Lizette. Yeah, the MLC has negotiated healthcare benefits for in-service and retired city workers, including CUNY in-service and retired workers, for decades. And we are not challenging the right to negotiate. What we are challenging is their claim that they are allowed to negotiate even things that they are prevented from in law from doing. In terms of the contact with the New York City Organization of Public Service Retirees, PSC has direct contact with that organization and with Mary Ann through folks who are part of our healthcare working group, and direct contact with their attorneys through our outside counsel.
Thank you, Dean. Okay, Jack Hammond.
I just recently retired. I'm new to the chapter. I've missed a lot of the backstory, so maybe this question has been answered before, but I'd like to ask it anyway, which is precisely about this association of retirees that filed the suit that produced the injunction. Why didn't the PSC enter in and join that suit?
Like I said, we were in contact with their attorneys and with the Organization of Public Service Retirees, and they consulted with us in terms of the legal strategy. But we did have some differences with them on several issues, including the issue of whether the MLC had the authority to negotiate retiree health benefits. But broadly, we're in agreement with them. And I think by filing this amicus brief, we have shown that we are share their position, and we're the only union that so far that has filed a brief stating that we're in support of the position that the city does not have the legal right to force retirees into Medicare Advantage, and that they are required by law to maintain it.
Thank you, Dean. John Highland. It says Jim Pearlstein, but it's John Highland. You have to unmute.
How about now?
Now
Yep.
we're good.
Okay. Dean, thank you for the report and for the work that's being done. My question is, what does that mean? Retirees will submit their papers later this month.
Yeah, the court set a schedule. They were initially, I think, supposed to file their papers early January. They asked, or no, even late December, I think, and they asked the court for an extension. So they're going to be submitting their papers, I think January 28th is their deadline.
Who's they, though? Who's
They're
there?
New York City Organization of Public Service Retirees.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean. Michael Engber.
Hi, I am unmuted. I received about 2 weeks ago notice that there's a so-called Accountable Care Organization, which is a consortium of Columbia Presbyterian, Weill Cornell. It's a shared savings program, and it's operating under the name New York Quality Care. It functions with a capitation, just like Medicare Advantage. So it looks to me like I've been backed into a Medicare Advantage lookalike without my consent and in violation of the TRO. I shouldn't say TRO, the T is no longer relevant. Does anybody know anything at all about this shared savings program, Accountable Care Organization, New York Quality Care? All these names are thrown at me in dismaying. The Accountable Care Organization looks to save money by organizing my care better than I would do myself. And if they save money, then it's kicked back to the doctors. Sounds like the doctors are now taking the role that Aetna would have taken had we entered into the Medicare Advantage situation.
Yeah, Mike, this is or Michael, is it Mike or Michael?
Either one. I'm
Okay.
happy.
This is the first time hearing about that. I don't know if Debbie Bell is not in the meeting, right?
No, I'm here.
Debbie, I don't know if you've heard anything about it. It sounds to me like it might be some sort of consortium of these hospitals, which they do from time to time. But it's the first I've heard of it.
It says all my care will be handled by New York Quality Care is the entity that welcomed me.
Michael, would you mind if we hold this question till later in the meeting?
Sure,
And
sure.
Debbie's going to be available and
Fine,
it
absolutely
doesn't-
fine.
And so we have, well, I see a lot of hands. We got to go through them quickly because Dean has to leave. Marcia, then Mike Frank, and then.
Okay, hello, hi, Happy New Year. I read the amicus brief and it said about the people in service, it gave some numbers. And I felt that it didn't include the fact that 11,000 of those people in service, in waiting, retirees in waiting are adjuncts who don't get insurance upon retirement. So I felt the numbers were a little fishy. I felt again, I've said this before, it doesn't state full-time retirees, and you have such a vast part-time population that this doesn't have anything to do with. So I just am once again asking for those distinctions to be made, and that the final number of in-service potential people is realistic, because no adjunct is going to be available, is going to be included. That's all.
Thanks,
Thank you
Marcia.
Thank you for reminding of that,
Well, I'm a pain.
of that, Marcia. Again, thank you. All right, Mike Frank and then Cecilia, and then we're gonna go to back to our program with Alan Feigenberg. Michael Frank.
Dean, you mentioned that the PSC is not challenging the right of the MLC to negotiate health care. I would assume it is also not challenging the right of them to negotiate health care without having a vote from the members who are affected by these changes. Am I correct on that there's no challenge to that, whether legally or otherwise, and which seems to be a fundamental principle of union democracy?
Yeah, no, there's a lot of work to do to improve the level of transparency and frankly, the internal democracy within the MLC. And we are part of that fight, and we are allied with a growing number of other MLC unions that are looking to make the MLC into a much more democratic and transparent and responsive organization. And that's definitely a long-term fight that Barbara waged for many years and that we are continuing.
Okay, Cecilia, thank you, Dean. Cecilia, you'll be the last question.
Okay, am I unmuted?
Yes.
I think Michael's question about accountable care, I think, Michael, if you have a long-term care policy with John Hancock, this is an organization that John Hancock has hired to sort of monitor the health of the people in their plan. I think that's what that is.
Thanks, Cecilia.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Dean. I know you have another meeting to go to.
Yes.
Just to be clear, there's no guarantee that the court is going to accept this brief. Is that true, or they've
Right.
already accepted it?
The way the court rules work is you have to file a motion to be permitted to file the brief at the same time as you give them the brief. So we filed our motion to be permitted to file the brief, and yeah, we're waiting to hear from the court whether they're going to accept it or not.
Okay, so we're okay in a bit of a unknown, uncharted territory.
Yeah, I'd say the chances are pretty good that they'll accept it, but no guarantees.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Dean, for making time to come and talk to us about.
You're welcome.
People should keep read the brief on the website, and we'll keep you updated as things develop. So
Great, thanks.
now we're going to make as smooth a transition as I can make to go back to our program on the yin and yang of our physical environment and hear a little bit about architecture. Alan, I don't want to shortchange your biography in the interest of time, and I won't.
That's fine.
No, I won't do that. You would think that Alan, being an, well, I shouldn't say you would think that. I would say I would have thought that or maybe before I met Alan, that architecture is a very linear kind of, nope, it is not, nor is Alan's career. Alan has a very, very distinguished career that's taken him many routes to where he finally landed as a professor of architecture at the School of Architecture at City College. He started his education at Parsons School in Design, and he was a leader there in in working to form an exclusive union of part-time faculty, and that took 15 years, and that is damn hard work. So Alan has gone from adjunct to temporary full-time faculty person to HEO to full-time professor to Professor Emeritus after 40 years. He's now an affiliate professor at the Grad Center in Environmental Psychology. He's directed the master's program in sustainability of the urban environment at City, and he's had serious grants primarily in education and teaching, and Alan is definitely a teacher. His professional architecture degree is from Columbia, 1969. He's also an architect at Feigenberg Associates, Urban Deadline Architects, New York City Community Development Agency, and New York City Human Resources Administration Program and Planning and Physical Development. Travel-wise, Alan has developed, organized, and led CCNY architecture study tours and exchanges with China, Cuba, and Germany. He's also a photographer, and which includes being juried and invited in individual and group shows and commercial work. So Alan looks to encourage social change through education and inspiration with his students. Architecture is a social vocation, not just through building, but also through pedagogy. And so thank you so much for taking time to come and talk to us today. Alan Feigenberg, Professor Emeritus of City College.
Hello.
Hello. Am I being heard?
Yes.
Oh, good. So thank you. I think it's
Yeah.
I'm delighted to be able to. What?
Everybody else has
Okay.
to be muted. Everybody
for Monday, February 12th.
Everybody else has to be muted.
Arrival with an 11:15.
I don't know who that is, but somebody.
How's that? How's that? Okay, so it's going to be a yin yang because we talked this over and we have a different way of talking, and our professions have a different way and a different level of seeing things and doing things. So let me put on what I intend to do.
While you're doing that, Alan, somebody can still be heard in the background. So please turn off your sound. Ava, can we figure out who this is?
I muted the person.
Thank you.
It might be me, right?
I don't know. Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
All right. Can you see what I have up here?
Yes, we do.
Okay. So obvious. All right. So one of the things, the first couple of things is that, of course, architecture is critical to all of us on many levels. So this one, is anybody work or teach at this place? Anybody work or teach at this place? Anybody work or teach at this place? How about this place? So all that I've showed you so far are all from CUNY campuses. And the one you see at City College, of course, has the kind of traditional backgrounds. And then the one on the left is this called the NAC building, which if you ask any of us is terrible for a lot of reasons. It's designed terribly. And when I used to take high school students here, they would look at it and they say, why are you taking us to this prison? And people who worked there felt this way. It also, you couldn't open windows. So it was a very unhealthy way of doing anything here. Well, to start you off, first, the second dean we had was Rosaria Piamelli. And this is when the architecture school was set up there in what used to be a parking garage. And it was set up here. And when I first came as an adjunct, I said, what are we doing here? Because there's exposed asbestos. And my colleagues were saying, yeah, we know that, but there's not very much this college will do about it. And this was my first pressure to start being very active in talking about City College administration. Rosaria Piamelli was the first woman dean of architecture in our entire country. And it was a great aspect to this, but with the faculty being 100% male, it didn't work out very well. And she was kind of pushed out of her position. Many years later, starting in the 80s, we had, I'm very biased, this incredible person, Max Bond, who was an architect who became dean of the School of Architecture. Max was just, as I said, I'm biased because I had him as a faculty. He was a teacher of mine at Columbia. I worked for him and with him, and I was his associate when he became the dean at City College. Then we went to that building. You must have noticed that one, but then became very moving us up, because when architecture started, it was almost all starting at 4 o'clock because the school was open for people who worked. And these were working class people in New York City who came to become architects. Now, under new administrations, it was to get it more like private architecture schools, where it'd be more full-time and more people of money. This became our new architecture school. It was an existing building that had been there that got ripped apart and became this, everybody would say, fabulous architecture building. The building is now called Spitzer, because Bernard and wife gave money for this. And when we were first told there was going to be a new school of architecture, there were a couple who said, well, who's paying the money? And we were told that they were not allowed to tell us this. And we found out who it was, and we found out why, because Spitzer, just not too far before this, had gotten big write-ups because he, as a owner of buildings in New York, had basically started getting rid of and firing a lot of the staff in the residential buildings who were Black and Latino, and putting in his white Eastern European workers. But they didn't want us to know about it because he was bringing us in good money. All right, so what I'm going to try and do is, I have a lot of pictures to show, but just an introduction of the way I would pursue this, as architecture being a very mixture of almost everything, and it's really art and science. So we as a group need to see things in a progressive, artistic, innovative way, but at the same time, our buildings have to stand up. There's a science for these things not falling down. Architecture is a physical reality, all right? It does reflect history of our development, of our usage, our reactions, our resistance, and changes. And you're all aware of this. You don't need an architect or a construction person to bring up these issues, because all of us share this, see it, use it on a daily basis, whether it's walking around, whether it's where we taught, whether it's our apartments. These are awarenesses, and there's too much of a claim that people who are not architects don't know about this. Everybody knows about this, okay? So in architecture, we feel that one is the history. The history is of the neighborhood, and especially New York. We all start thinking about this, the people who were there, who were allowed to stay, who were thrown out, the institutions involved, whether this becomes an educational community or whether it becomes a factory community, the open spaces, meaning where people can go. It could be parks, sociology and anthropology. It forms in spaces of people. And we show pictures, but you all know if you're walking down the street and you see buildings, but even 4-year-olds can tell you where the rich people live and where the poor people live. It's quite obvious in our visual aspects of what we know about society within our society. The science of building materials. Now we're facing this more and more because building materials create things in our environment. And we want to try and be a lot more conscious about this so we're not using and reusing materials that constantly screw up an environment for pulling them out of the earth and then putting them back and then tearing them down and then putting them back, right? Life science. As you all know, again, it affects on people through built and natural environments. It's a real trip, I think, for a lot of us to go to Central Park and to be able to walk around this place. It's in the middle of our city that for many years was always an attempt to build in it. And luckily, there was always this fight to keep it there. So it was a public space that we could all take advantage of and use. And then, of course, art histories, past, present, and how this moves on. All right. This is a library that's built out in Queens and was taken as a very good, strong aspect by these younger architects who felt that a library is important because of what they did, but the space itself was critical, and especially for young people. And it felt like a space they could move around. It looked like things weren't quite permanent. They were moving around. And part of what a lot of us valued or judged is that architecture should be seen so that you could see what was holding it up, what the structure was, what the columns were, where the air was coming in and going out. So that part of libraries was to learn, and not just by reading books or looking at the pods, but also looking at your environment and figuring this out. Right? So if you see, oops, too fast. Okay? Where am I going? Okay. So we shape it. And I think one of the things, another aspect is in architecture, there's too much oversight of what we know and how this is not or is going to affect people. So architecture is education. It's educational. It empowers our awareness of our physical environments and how it works. And this depends on who we are, what our experience has been, what our culture is, what our class is, and where we have developed and grown up. All right? Knowing different. Schools are environments for learning and developing. New York City, every city has this indication that there's a difference between going to different types of environments, physical environments that are meant for learning, where it's clear that the kids are not being given an environment for their learning. It's more like a jail where they're forced to go, they're forced to sit in lines, they're not allowed things, and it's partly the physical environment that reinforces this, right? So we owe to future generations the best, most supportive, most stimulating, and most sustainable environment, sustainable. So here's what I see. I think our generation, my generation, our generation, for all the things we did, really kind of fucked up the environment. Our kids are having a big struggle, and now with some of us who have grandkids, we are sending them into such an environment where there's such struggle to do that we've set up that we have responsibility for. Here's another example, and I give this when I'm working with anybody in the schools, and of course, it's not in the United States. This is in Dutch, in Holland, and this is the way some schools, this is a working class school, by the way, schools are seen, and they're environments, total environments for kids, for children. And they're not given these rooms they have to go into, and doors are closed and everything. But as you can see, an environment that's their environment, where things are designed for their size and their scale, and they have access to move around and do it with what they choose, not what is set up for them. This is being built, and this is one of the things, again, not in New York yet, but this is talking about spaces that are starting with, have a focus more on the computer technology. And there's not a knowledge of what's going to happen in 5 years, 10 years. So a lot of the design they do about it is a space that has a great deal of flexibility. It looks like it serves what happens now, but as you can see, a lot of the spaces, the doors, the walls and everything are relatively temporary, where they can come down, they can be reinvented and redesigned to fall into different conditions. The structure, and as you can see, the piping and everything, that's to remain, save money. All right. Now, this was already talked about. Tom talked about this, of what you set up. So one of the indications is national requirements. And some of these in basis are good, like the EPA, Environmental Protection. And this was one of the government agencies that Trump, they tried to wipe this out immediately and not give any demands on private enterprise that wanted to make money. Now, as you see in New York City, there are a lot of things. It may have good design, it may solve all these problems, but it has to go through many areas allowing this to happen. Building department, the commissions that have to do, as you see, with landmarks, and there are always debates and struggles on this, because what some people see as landmarks that should not come down, other people say, hey, get it down, let's get something better. Codes, and I'll show you a little bit about that, and ordinances that tells you what you can do and can't do for certain things, for what it's used for, whether it's housing, whether it's a library, whether it's a hospital, and whether it's 1 story or whether it's 20 stories. Safeguards show that, and certain restrictions, right? Differences. So this is just to lay out when an architect sits down, or even an engineer will sit down with us, or us with them, the variations that we have to design, and these are the variations in what any piece of architecture will cost. Of course, the uses, the conditions, the cost will be very different if we are doing a hospital than if we're doing a shopping center. The loads, which means the loads, the weights on, the spans, how open it is. Clearly, a basketball stadium is going to need larger spans than restaurants. Fire ratings, thermal needs, et cetera, et cetera. And then one of the things that is really a relatively new and a much harder one to struggle with is down near the bottom, where we say where labor is, unfortunately, from those that are putting together, a major issue. And there's constantly a struggle between our union labor and our non-union labor. And very often there's a struggle because the non-union labor tends to cost a lot less money, but they're less qualified, they're less educated, and the buildings go up under them. They're much more dangerous in my position, all right? Environmental issues. What has to happen to have rules and regulations that when we're doing architecture and buildings, they're not adding to the screw-ups we've already made to our environment? And then social issues, how they open up or how they disband from different peoples, all right? So not going to go into this, but if you see, these are the different occupancies, A, B, C, D, all the way down to U. So each of these, when it says like education, which most of us are aware of, it has the specifics of what it has to do. A1, A2 are the different variations of that. So it'll tell you what it is, and then it'll start to tell you when you look it up, what the hazards are and what these conditions have to do specifically and why they're specifically different. So again, storage will be a very different thing than factory. Education will be a very different thing than hazardous. And these are things that are critical that sometimes a little too open to interpretation, all right? So in New York, now I'll get a little visually, we see contradictions, conflicts all the time. And we are all used to this. We can see what we call brownstones, and we see probably understand or know something about the history of the ones on the left and the ones on the right. We can probably figure out the economics of who was able or still able to live to the ones on the left and the ones on the right. And we can pretty well determine what neighborhood or place in New York City they are. All right? Look closely, all right? A lot of these buildings you can see, the windows are closed up. So we see this in New York, and we have to think about indications. What are the indications? Well, this could be really interesting because something is done and it's a very historic neighborhood, and these are wonderful buildings, and what they're doing is they're renovating them and bringing them up to modern needs and modern technology. Or what happens a lot, we'll see pictures of this in a city like New York, They're getting and throwing out all these people because they're going to take over all these 4-story buildings and rip them down because they have high-rise buildings to put up, and change the use and the format of this area and change the aspect of money. Now, one of the things in a lot of our architecture, if you look carefully and see each of these buildings, you'll see that the line, the vertical line in each of them is 3, going vertical, 1, 2, 3. And the horizontal, when you go up, is 1 at the bottom where the door and the stairs are, 2 is the 3 floors, and then 3 is above where the roof is. So in each case, 3 and 3 is a design indication of Christianity, where 3 is a basic number that creates part of architecture, primarily in the states of the United States and Western Europe. If we learn at architecture and do an analysis in those from Asia, and they go through 2s, which is the yin-yang basis, we see a very different aspect of the design and the forming of architecture in these 2 areas. All right, so you're all used to this. We're walking around the city, and there's certain aspects of the city are undergoing change. The one on the left is right near City College, and you can see in the middle is the new building going up. It's very different. We know that because of the way it's designed. We know because of the materials, and we know because in this area it has outdoor places where you can go out and have a balcony. Well, this was built and finished almost 4 years ago, and they can't sell it because people who have enough money don't want to live here yet. So this is on Amsterdam Avenue, right below 131st Street, right? But you can see the buildings aside. We can start determining the one on the left is older because it has the fire escapes on the outside. The one on the right has people who have a little more money because we can see air conditioners in it. The one on the right, again, you can see, and we all have a lot of understanding and knowledge about what's happening. We can see a building like the one on the right, where we see new windows in there, where we know there's been some effort to improve the building, right? We see the new one going up in the back, right? And we see it going higher and higher and higher. And it's made of concrete, not of the brick. The windows are generally going to be larger because they can sell for more conditions, right? Again, walking around. We see this also all the time. And you can see on the right, and then the middle, the left. So you see commercial, and then commercial with what used to be, what's been turning into housing. And a lot of places in New York, which used to be offices, well, I'll get more to that. But what you see now is all kinds of things that I'll get to that have to do with what the city has set up as conditions on what is allowed to be built there and how tall it's allowed to be, right? A lot of this is open for, whoops, right? We see like this. So, you know, walking around a city, if you want to say, what is it about the city? Why is it like people or designers, like cars, want everything to be different? The thing they're designing has to be different than what exists because that makes them the artist. Not to see what is good or what makes it, well, and here goes an example that I have, right? It shows what we see what it, don't know what it's about. And all this has been taken by people who have to figure out something to put this stuff in place. Housing, all right? So I use this again because this is examples, obviously, of housing. It's not low-income housing, and it's not real expensive housing. How do we know that? Well, it's all brick. Windows will tend to be bigger here than they are in low-income housing, but smaller they are in rich housing, all right? It has, some of them have the balconies where they can walk out, and some of them don't. We can usually tell also the basis of intelligence. If you look at the one on the left, you see the floors that are horizontal or white. That's the concrete. And then the brick and windows are put on top of it, and then the concrete and on top of it. And the ones on the right, we don't see that distraction. Part of what gets found out but resisted is the one on the left may look nice because you have each floor separated, but it doesn't work in terms of our environment, because what happens is that anything that happens outside in terms of water, in terms of cold, in terms of heat, is transferred very easily into the inside because it has those concrete floors. All right. Well, housing, a lot of people live there, and a lot of people feel very uncomfortable because they can't point to which is theirs unless it has a special air conditioner on it. Right? Variations. I mean, this is what I find absolutely amazing. And again, part of it is when working with students, especially, you look at this and they're done by, quote, famous architects, and they're written up as being really good. And the students see this and they say, well, that's what I'm going to try and do because that's better than what exists. But there's no, if one is better, what is it that makes it better? And why aren't they all pick up those same aspects to make good places? Don't you feel that you know where you're going in New York? Don't you feel you know what a building is? Some of them seem to be more vertical, some to be more horizontal, some to have different seams to them. One looks like a church, one looks like an office building. Okay, so now what we're seeing all over, especially as you see it on the left and in the middle, is we're seeing both office buildings and housing that are going up with the claim that putting all glass is an efficiency. Right? Well, it might be, but it takes a lot more money to produce glass. Glass has to be cleaned, where bricks doesn't have to do it in the same basis. Glass has a higher way that it needs to be set up to resist both heat and cold. Glass is difficult because if you look back on the left one, it reflects the sun into the other one. And a lot of these really high ones are so tall that you know from the city, especially Manhattan, that you don't get sun. All right. And then you see them in the evenings. All right. And then one of the things that's again, for me, is very overlooked is the folks that have to put these together, the workers. In New York, like other places, the main rewards, as it were, are given to the architects because we design it. And the idea that it has to be worked out and figured out and done by all these folks who are called construction workers is not given the same high quality. And these folks, as you can see, work in very, very dangerous conditions. And without them, nothing here would happen. Right? What do you think of this one? All right. So here to me was like the yin yang, right? We see older, more traditional buildings from this city, right? They're made out of stone. They have small windows. And then we see the modern one. It's all glass. Sometimes it's hard to tell whether there's a building there. What happens if the sun shines on it? What happens if it needs to be washed? And then more of the stuff going up. The construction of it. One of the things that, I certainly agree with, found interesting, when I was getting trips to go to Cuba, it was an architecture exchange. And the students and I would go in and work with Cuban students and Cuban architects. And one of the things that was always just wonderful to see, but raised a lot of questions, an example of an extreme, is one time we were there and we went into like a little auditorium. And the students there work in groups and teams, not individually. And they had been working on a medical center. And they were working on it because a medical center had to be designed because one had to be built. And the students were in a group working with it, and they had people working with them who were architects, engineers, doctors, nurses, people who cleaned up the hospital, and people who were in the hospital. And then when they made their presentation, they had this whole group of people there talking to them and asking questions because they were the ones that were going to be using and had the best understanding of what a hospital needed to be. If you went to something like that where an architect was designing a hospital in New York, you would never get that. You would get the designers, the architects, but the people who paid the money for the hospital, and that would be where the agreement would be. Okay, so zoning ordinances, this was already mentioned, right? The zoning ordinances say in certain areas we can have buildings, we can have high-rise buildings, they can be residential. In other areas, they can be office buildings. In other areas, they can be factories. And each of these were set up originally to try and make certain that certain things, certain uses were in different places and they didn't interfere. And that meant physically, but also financially. So if you look at this, this just gives you what the indications are. And the bottom one is to try and make simply a very easy drawing sketch to show visually what that would mean in terms of what these were about. Now, right? So if you set the building back from the street, we see here, here, or here, it means that setting it back allowed the building to go higher than it would by the code. So the idea was, this is all on 6th Avenue, all right? So the idea was, well, this will make it a nicer area because we'll widen the streets. There'll be less shadow in there. There'll be more light. And in cases when this opened, as you can see, and most of you are familiar with, that space was drawn back. You couldn't use it for anything. I mean, look at that great furniture to sit down on, which is the stone. Or the thing in the CBS building in the right, where a lot of people can't use it because it's all steps. All right. The thing on the left shows, then this was one of the concepts that came up. And the idea was in a place like New York is you needed, because you couldn't stop high-rise buildings. The idea is that give some restrictions that as buildings go up, they step back. So there's more sun that can come into the space, property, yard, building, setback. All right. The one on the right shows how they took the same specifics, but instead of stepping it back, they went up and then they gave it a diagonal. And they thought that architecturally, this would look much more interesting. Now, there's a thing that a lot of you know about called air rights, development rights. And the basis was, if you look at the right, is that there's kind of older architecture, that's the building. And then what you see is the kind of reddish orange on top is that building by code was allowed to go up that far. But the owners of that building said, well, we're not going to do that. So we're going to take what we can do and we're going to sell it to the building that's going up next to us, which is only allowed to go up a certain number. And what we're going to do is sell them the ability to go up 3 more floors. And these folks are saying, God, that's great. We're going to be able to make more money. And on a certain level, this had a certain, people felt, basis of understanding. You see the one on the left, it has to do with the church or synagogue. Actually, on 79th Street, it was a synagogue, and they sold it so it made money for the congregation. And then what happened is that you can see the one on the left, it's a catty corner from that one. And then some developer said, well, that's really good. And they started moving the building they bought was half a block away. And then it was a block away. And then it was 3 blocks away. And at that point, the planning commission saying, wait, we didn't mean it quite that much. So we better relook at the law that we did. Right? Now you see on the right and the left.
Alan?
Yeah.
This is really, really rich and fascinating, but can I ask you to start?
I'm taking too much.
No, it's just that we want to have time for dialogue and we want to have time for people to ask questions. And it's 25 of 3.
Okay, sorry about that. I'll go through real quick then. I'll just show a lot of stuff. Thank you. Sorry. Some of it's going to be repetitive though, okay? Fire escapes. So you see fire escapes, you know what type of building is here. That got eliminated, so your fire escapes are inside. This was a big fight so that other people could have access. Okay, so real quick. So this is, you see building code. So this is how you could get out of a building if there was a fire. Some being a little better. Now, bottom right was a building, and you can see as the buildings go up, there's less and less space and more that have to do with elevators. And if you look in the middle, that's where the 2 stairs are that you have in case there's a fire. Not very easy to go to. All right, let's give you more. I was going to talk about this or this or this or this. An architect's observation. My joke. Kids that we worked with to try and get them interested in the city. I'll be real quick. This was a project that was done by City College School of Architecture. And it was a competition for solar energy, and they gave the dimensions and everything. And we were one of 30 groups chosen from colleges from all over the world. And it was set up in Washington, D.C., and it's now on the roof of architecture. Variations on how we create a better environment. The future. All the buildings you see slanted, that's to pick up solar. Contradictions. All right, and the last thing I guess to show, you've all been reading about this, of how there's more and more corporations and companies moving out. So there are more and more buildings that are going vacant, but not for people. And the idea is starting to turn offices into housing. And a lot of these can be done because it's very flexible. And my suggestion is we have all these buildings, right? Let's turn them into housing and let people, and all of you must have seen this, or some of you have seen this in yesterday's Times. All right. I would suggest it's a good thing to look over. New York has room for housing. And there's some good studies about what it is. The thing they're missing is how much it's going to cost.
Ah,
All right. I'm sorry if I went on too long.
no, that's okay, Alan.
My apologies.
There's so much, it is really a wealth of material, and I want to give us time to have questions and some discussion for both you and for Tom. So thank you very, very much. Thank you.
Can I, one quick thing? Somebody here who joined us is David Chapin from the Graduate Center.
Yes.
And he also has an architecture as kind of a background. And David and I were teaching together called Food and Architecture. And one of the things was taking students from different backgrounds and ethnicities, and they would research restaurants all over the city. And then we would all go to visit and eat together to see what architecture had to do with eating, had to do with culture.
Fascinating. Okay. Okay, I see Joan Greenbaum. I see Peter Reynes. I see Erwin Yelowitz. Questions for both, or comments for both Tom and Alan? Joan.
Thank you, Alan, for that city tour. I love walking around the city and looking up and looking down. My question for you and Tom is, up through the 60s, and I think from the beginning, early in the century, unions had a role in building affordable, what we now call affordable housing. And is there any movement now by groups like unions to do this? Or how do we make it happen, really?
Tom, I don't know.
Okay.
Tom? Tom is muted.
Unions play a contradictory role in housing development. Construction unions love all buildings that provide jobs.
Yep.
So they're pro-development. There are many internal contradictions that having to do with construction unions. There have been many fights. Communities who are opposing mega developments that are potentially going to displace many people in their neighborhoods because the new developments are luxury. And that's where the best union jobs are, actually, because a lot of low-cost, low-rise buildings can be built without union labor. But when we start getting into major towers, it pretty much has to be unionized, because you need a diversity of skills, and and quality in construction so that the builder doesn't get sued every time there's a mess up. And so, and that's another really glaring contradiction in New York City. Union versus non-union construction. A lot of construction outside the core in the outer boroughs is non-union labor.
Yep.
And it's because you have small scale developers who were building, say, 3-4 story multifamily homes, or that, you know, it just doesn't work. The numbers don't work if you have to hire union labor.
Excuse me.
There's a big divide in the union movement.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of
Tom?
union, I'm sorry.
Excuse me for a moment. Yeah, I think what you're saying is really important. And maybe I didn't phrase my question right, but I'm thinking of amalgamated houses and the houses on the west side of Manhattan, where unions actually build housing with preference for city workers. So how do we go about building?
The vehicle for that was the Mitchell-Lama
Yeah.
program, city and state funding for Mitchell-Lama. That's dried up. And so union sponsored house, and also unions have changed. And they're, you know, union welfare funds are supporting housing development all over the country, including places where their union members don't live.
Yeah.
Because they're not all of them are actually occupied by union members. So, you know, the conditions for, and also, you know, there's a big divide between, I've been on many, involved in many local controversies where you had a major luxury development. I mean, I worked for years against the Atlantic Yards development in Brooklyn, which was a big capital, and it was high rise and mostly luxury. And the community was organized to oppose it. And guess who shows up in opposition to the community? The construction unions.
Yeah.
And there's another divide because a lot of construction workers don't live in the city anymore.
Right.
And so they're not as involved with local politics. They're not engaged in any other way with communities. So it's strictly business.
I agree.
Peter Reynes?
Am I on mute? Yes. Thanks, Alan and Tom. Very interesting discussions. I learned a lot. Here's a question more for Tom. Your recent book's called Zoned Out. So you're an academic and obviously you're an activist. And I wonder, recently I heard James Davis speak, I think before the city council, where he lamented the fact that nonprofit Columbia and NYU, you know, own half the city practically, real estate. I went to NYU in '65, got my doctorate. NYU was at Washington Square Park. Now from 40th Street to Houston Street, all NYU. Columbia, all the north of Manhattan. So as an activist, Tom, I wonder if you've been active in trying to roll back this exemption that Columbia and NYU have, and it hurts CUNY. We're underfunded, and these two mammoth real estate moguls have all this money available. The other point is for Alan. It's more a comment. I was recently in Germany to commemorate the 85th anniversary of Kristallnacht, and I was able to visit Berlin, and I was just blown away the city is widespread. You can see from any place in Berlin, a mile or two, there's no obstruction. Apparently, they have a city code of 8 stories. I haven't been to Paris in a long time. I imagine Paris the same. But New York, I know it's too late, but just a comment that in New York, you can't see anything. It's just these these ugly high rises. Thank you.
I'll add quick to you because you brought up Boston, you brought up Berlin, because they took on a whole policy. And what they started doing is also starting to eliminate cars from going in. So they worked in putting all the subways and trains together so you could go anywhere. They also, any building that went up that was housing or commercial with it, that they were doing new within a certain thing, was not allowed to have parking for cars. They were not allowed to do that. Any piece of land that had no building on it that was green, they were not allowed to put a building on. And all the things you're doing, every building was more solar energy oriented than anything else that I know of anywhere.
Yeah, I would just also, in response to Peter, say, the original zoning resolution, zoning ordinance, was explicitly designed to create conditions for light and air to remain.
Right.
And that continues to be the historical myth because it's not a reality.
Yeah.
Every time the zoning resolution gets changed because developers see that land values have increased and building higher means more money, the zoning gets changed. But you have to go to Midtown and look up and say, where's the light and air?
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense. And I think it has to do with land. And it's the one thing I didn't mention, which is really at the root of the problem, which is land is a commodity. It's land that gets bought and sold by real estate. It has nothing to do with providing housing or for providing space for businesses. It's whatever maximizes the future value, that is, a value in trade of the land. And it's not the building. It's not the building they're selling. They're selling access. And the location of the investment is what determines the use. Zoning is just a figment. It really doesn't matter. It's the location. I mean, take a real estate course. Real estate 101 is location, 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 the 3 basic principles. That's how they make money. It's not the building value by itself. It's having that office building centrally located or that apartment building centrally located and located in a place where not just the current value, but the future value, and it's short-term future, by the way, because the capitalist mentality is the horizon is 10, 20 years at which you have to recover your initial investment. And that's why Manhattan sucks. As we're confronting all of the current issues, it was built for an epoch that has already passed. And for, with a whole approach that's already passed. And union, by the way, let me just say quickly about unions, construction unions, but the service unions are the ones who, building workers are the ones who have been progressive politically when it comes to urban policy, including on questions of racial exclusion.
Agreed.
Okay, Erwin. Erwin? Erwin, can I not be heard?
Yes, now I'm unmuted. Alan brought up the question of office buildings, which are being converted or can be converted to residential. And I'd like to follow up on that question, on that point that he made, because it seems to me that this is one of the major resources in the city as we move away from 5-day, 9 to 5 office living. And I don't think that's ever coming back. And so we have a redundancy in office space. And the questions that I have for Alan and perhaps for Tom as well is it possible to really redo these buildings in a realistic fashion? As do they exist in a form that can be changed to apartments without tearing down the whole building? And second, will the owners of the buildings, this is a point that Tom has made, will the owners of the buildings see it as a profitable enterprise to convert it to housing? And if so, how is the city going to encourage that kind of development? It seems to me this is a major issue because we need housing, and here's this empty space which is standing there available.
Well, I'll go first and let Alan give the answer the part about the architecture and suitability. But I think there are a lot of problems. Remember after 9/11 and billions of dollars were poured into Lower Manhattan, the city changed the regulations that were, well, even before that, they were starting to do that, change the regulations that made it difficult for owners to convert from office to residential.
Right.
But now if we look at Lower Manhattan around Ground Zero, what do you got? It's a luxury enclave. Is that the socially most, is that providing housing for those who need it most? It's not. There's no affordable housing. Oh, there's very little affordable housing. And it's because of the land value. It's not because of the value of the buildings. It's because it's centrally located. Everybody with a few $1 million to invest in buying an apartment wants to be there. But who else can? We just had a long fight actually to get an affordable housing built near Ground Zero. And even before 9/11, there were conversions. The city changed the zoning regulations because there was a lot of vacant manufacturing and office space in Lower Manhattan, and they got converted. But it only makes sense if there's a market for it. And that sort of brings up the dilemma when you're talking about solving the housing problem. Solving it for who? The people who need housing the most are low-income working people. And those buildings are not going to be for low-income working people unless there is deep subsidy from the public sector, or wages go up much higher than they are now, so that working people who live and work in Manhattan and surrounding areas can afford to live there. So, that's there's the constant that the real estate industry is just going crazy all the time, talking about we need more housing. It's supply side mania. We don't need more housing. We need more truly affordable, dedicated housing, and it's going to require public subsidies as long as wages remain too low for people to afford to live decently. And in Manhattan, I don't know how anybody at the lower end making minimum wage can afford to stay in a decent apartment.
Okay, so for the other element that you asked, is one of the showed you was a squarish building with all the things in the center, the elevators and the stairs and anything. So it can be worked out to do this in a lot of the buildings for housing. You have the core here, and you can simply bring out aisles there to do it. It's all on the outside, so you can open the windows. What has to be, the structure is even better than it would be for housing, so it can carry a lot of stuff. And the main thing that needs some severe work on it is plumbing. But that can be done because the space down there is you have the room, but remember, you have these ceilings there. And in between where those ceilings are is where all the ducts and everything can run. And that already happens with the heating and the air conditioning. So it's a matter of going in and doing it. I think it's very peaceful. If you look at things like in the 20s or in Greenwich Village, where a lot of those older buildings that had to do with production or whatever, they turned into some of the greatest buildings and spaces for people to live that there's anything that exists in the city. So yeah, I think it's very possible and it also for commercial folks, it's very good because as you bring people down there, it means they have larger groups that they can sell to.
And you're muted.
Thank you. I don't want to be coughing into people's faces. We're getting close to 3 o'clock. Mike, I know you asked a question on another topic. Can I come back to you after I finish the queue? And I think Dave Cuddlechuck, you'll be the end of the queue on this, if that's
Sure.
okay.
Absolutely.
May I?
Yes, Arlene.
Yes, Arlene. Hi,
Oh.
Tom. Since we've worked together,
Yes.
my area is noise, and Tom knows that I've worked with architects and designers. And yet during this talk, I did not hear about the impact of noise and how important design is. Because if you check back, my earliest study was done on schools, and that's what I believed the speaker noted. Schools, they have to be quieter for children to learn. Are the architects that sensitive enough to make sure that the schools that are put up today are quiet enough to hold out the noise from outside? What's happened, New York City has become noisier. If you come to my home, since I serve on Grow NYC, and on that site, people can call me respect to noise, you'd see how many of them are due to maybe noisy air conditioners that have just been put up. And that could be corrected. One thing I learned when I worked with the Transit Authority, after I found trains were noisy and they affected children's learning, that we can make changes and improve. And what I would like to see is that more architects and designers are in tune to the impacts of noise as they are to air and water, because New York City needs to be a quieter city in order for it to be a healthier one. So I'd like that issue addressed because it is critical. And by the way, when I worked with the TA, I have no engineering background. I helped design a quieter traction motor for the TA. I helped them with their design, and I had nothing in my educational background except just some common sense. So thank you. And hi, Tom. We haven't seen each other in a while.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Arlene.
I think, can we take that more as a comment and suggestion rather than a question for response? Because I want to move the program along. I see Francine Egger-Sider's name, but not the face.
Hi, I'm actually Shauna Vey.
Hi, Shauna Vey. I know the name. Hi, Shauna Vey.
Hi, sorry about that mix up. Thanks for a great program. Tom, you mentioned, and I remember hearing a lot at the time about what Bloomberg did for sustainability for the for at the lower Manhattan with the hurricanes and whatnot. But I have not heard anything about that since, or very, very little from the next two mayors. So I wondered if you know, first of all, was Bloomberg's work there effective and useful? And secondly, has it been continued today? Are we in much better shape for flooding?
Well, I wouldn't credit Bloomberg for it necessarily. He was doing what the business and landowners in Lower Manhattan knew was a necessity. The next storm was going to threaten the value of their property. That, you know, the Army Corps of Engineers just finished a long study about building retaining walls, which was the Bloomberg idea originally, a big U around Lower Manhattan, and fortifying Lower Manhattan. My opinion, that's a crazy plan. Number one, knowing the pace at which government works, by the time they'll never get it done for the next storm. Secondly, they start in the Lower East Side, the one neighborhood where there's still some working class housing left in Lower Manhattan, claiming that they're going to protect public housing. I don't know. I don't know about that. They're tearing up a park in order to build this barrier. And the thing is, it takes massive expenditures, and they're not readily available, and it'll take years. The way government, especially the way government here works. The Army Corps of Engineers just finished its major study, reaffirming more or less the Bloomberg plan. And environmental justice groups opposed it. Not all of them, but some of them did. And I think for good reason. It's too little, too late. And it's not comprehensive, because you know the billions of dollars that are going to go in to build those barriers could be better spent on protecting the higher value of working people in Queens and the Rockaways and other places, Red Hook, because they're not going to, by the time the city and the state and federal government get around to it, they're going to be underwater.
Is there an alternate plan on the table or in the work?
Not that I know of.
Okay, thanks.
Ava, and then Dave Cuddlechuk.
Yeah, this was a great discussion presentation. Usually I don't ask questions, but I really had a question, so thanks for letting me ask a question. But this is more to Alan. I guess I think a lot about like how sustainable with climate change is it to just like have endless new building construction? Like it doesn't seem to ever be part of the discussion. Like what are the costs to taking these materials from the earth, to the energy goes to build it, to the cost of demolishing existing buildings. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the costs and benefits to new buildings that maybe are more green versus all of the costs it takes to the environment to like build that new building versus like older buildings that are less energy efficient, but should we be focusing on retrofitting those buildings and bringing them, making them better and greener? I don't know. I'm always wondering about the balance between those two things.
Good. It's a variable, obviously, but what happens is that when research is done, it has been done in taking how much it will cost us environmentally to put up new buildings. It has to do with getting the material, the energy that's done in doing that, taking the material to where it has to be processed, taking it from the process to where it has to be built, all the equipment it does to put the building in place, all the equipment does to do it. And in most cases, we're talking about our environment in a negative way being influenced by 45 43 to 45% of the problems in our environment are done by the construction process. So I think there are, and I don't think it's 100%, buildings that can be much more easily converted. And a lot of the older buildings that have strong stone walls and very little openings for glass can tend to be turned into more energy efficient buildings and putting on solar panels than other things. This thing of putting up new buildings, and Tom was talking about that, is that with the money that's used, there are times that are set that it won't possibly be used more than 10 or 20 years. Then it's going to be taken down because the mortgage is paid and you're going to build a new one. So I think in general, absolutely, we want to focus more on recreating what we have and improving it. That's what I got to say. So, okay, so I'll add to that, because one of the things I think is very problematic personally is that very little of that is gone and talked about and taught and used very importantly in our schools of education. And even at City, where the design, the visual becomes a much more important aspect than what that construction and building is going to do in our environment.
Thank you. Okay, Dave.
Yeah. Thanks. I'd like to echo a little bit about what Tom was talking about land values. I happen to live in a former Mitchell-Lama building that has 245 apartments. The land that the land on which it's built was sold to my landlord for $250,000. So and there was just a limitation on the amount, on the way they could increase rents, so that we live in what used to be a Mitchell-Lama building. The problem is eventually it's returned to the private sector and higher rents. I'd like to ask Tom if there's a possibility that we could reconstitute Mitchell-Lama programs for longer periods of time so that they could be low income and low and middle income for another 50 years or permanently. Tom, could you?
Well, yes. First, you'd have to sabotage the political strategies of the real estate industry.
Yes.
They were happy to see that they got their wish of limiting Mitchell-Lama once it was passed, and preventing it from being repeated up in Albany.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the real core of the problem. Is it's the land. That one of my favorite phrases. It's the land, stupid. It's not the buildings. They make their money on location. The three principles of real estate: location, location, location. So if you can get that land, and one of the other crazy contradictions that show you how dumb our society operates. It's I did a little back of the envelope study. Well, it was a little more than that, about who owns the land in New York City. Would you believe it? It's not real estate. Real estate is so expensive because they don't own most of the land. If you take streets, sidewalks, all the public areas, the parks, unbuildable areas, the majority of the land is not privately owned. What if all of the land were publicly owned? What if we gave it back to the Lenapes? What if?
Right on.
Yes, and essentially, you could make society could make decisions about what the best way of organizing space is, and we could hire more architects to do that too, right? Because architects are limited by their clients. And their clients are there to make money out of buying and selling land. And so, politically, real estate is so powerful in New York City, they call the tune. And they can do that also because they've tricked us all over the long term into being the major financiers of elected officials at city and state levels. And they're the largest single tax-paying category. Business in Manhattan provides a lot of tax funds. And so the elected officials are doubly, the real estate industry finances their campaigns, but then they also remind the people they elected, your largest single source of tax revenues comes from us, so you better be careful.
Yeah, thank you.
And so let's just get rid of the landowners and create communities that really work and are healthy and are environmentally sustainable.
Well, I think on that,
Thank you.
on that note, that's a great way to close. I want to thank both of our speakers. Wonderful presentations, very informative, lively discussion. I wish we had time for more. There's never enough time. Tom has a book.
Can I just interrupt for a second and ask people to go and take our 3-question survey to tell us how you read our newsletter? It's in the chat, the little URL, and just tell us how you read it. So, because we're having to make decisions about digital versus paper. Okay?
Yeah.
It'll take you 2 seconds. It's in the chat.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know if Debbie is still here. We're over time. I don't think that there are any new developments. If there are, Debbie, maybe you can give us a telescopic version. Otherwise, if there are questions for Debbie,
I'm here.
You're here. I see you.
Let me speak briefly about the question about accountable care organizations.
Okay, good. Yes, we will.
First of all, anyone who receives such a letter, it does not indicate that your health coverage has changed. It does not mean your health coverage has changed. This is a structure that has been approved by federal Medicare as a way for providers to organize themselves to, in their words, provide the right care at the right time. There are cost savings sharings opportunities. This is one of those things that I suspect is a good intention strategy by the federal government to improve the quality of care and try to save money that will be taken over by the hospitals to their advantage. So that I appreciate Michael Engber's cynical response to, does this mean, there's going to be, the doctors are going to work real hard to get a share of this money? Probably, or the hospitals will. But the main point is, this does not indicate a change in your coverage. I suspect what it indicates is that one of your providers is part of a structure that has been established within the hospital where they're employed, or as a group practice where they're employed. Nothing more than that. And beyond that, there is, as Dean indicated, the lawsuits, there have not been any developments. And I don't even think oral arguments will be heard in the city's appeal of Judge Frank's injunction until March, given that the retiree organization doesn't have to submit paperwork until the end of January, at which point both parties have the opportunity to do paperwork responses. So this is all going on and on and on.
Okay, thank you very much, Debbie. Well, again, thank you to the speakers. Great presentations. Thank you, Marcia Newfield, for the concept. The next meeting is in February. I won't give you a whole disquisition on it, but the featured speaker will be Manny Ness. professor of political science at Brooklyn College and an international scholar. He will discuss his book, Migration as Economic Imperialism, How International Labor Mobility Undermines Economic Development in Poor Countries. And the book is based on 10 years of research that Manny did in origin states and destination countries, including Nepal, Vietnam, Malawi, El Salvador, Western Europe, North America, key destinations in the global South, the Arab Gulf states, Malaysia, Thailand, Korea, and Japan. And the book demonstrates that migration is based on a system of unequal exchange, and that remittances do not develop poor countries, as the IMF, the World Bank, and even the UN have argued. Manny has also interviewed trade union leaders in each of these countries and beyond, and brings a labor union perspective to his talk. So we will give you more information about that in our next blast. And I think it's probably also in the newsletter. Reminder to fill out the survey that Diane called your attention to. We want to know if we should keep publishing our turning the page on paper and sending it out to you, which, as you know, is a big, big expense, but we will do it depending on demand. Are there any other announcements before we close? Well, thank you very much. Stay healthy, stay safe, and thank you for a wonderful program, and we'll see you in February.
Thank you.
Meeting is adjourned.